The champagne flute was slipping from his fingers, and I couldn't move fast enough to stop any of it. Not the glass. Not the silence that swallowed the room after it hit marble. Not my son's voice still hanging in the air between 400 people who had stopped breathing at the same time. The string quartet cut out mid-bow. Not a fade, a severance. Like even the musicians understood that whatever sound came next needed to come from somewhere else in the room. Photography lights burned the back of my neck. The smell of lilies and pooled champagne mixed on marble floor. And every face in that ballroom was turning toward us in a slow cascade that I could feel more than see. Because my vision had gone tight and narrow, the way it does when your body decides to survive a moment your mind hasn't caught up to yet. My son's hand was in mine, small and warm and completely steady, because he didn't understand what he'd just done. He was 5 years old. He was wearing a navy suit and a clip-on bow tie he'd adjusted 3 times in the hallway mirror before we left the house. He was holding an empty champagne flute that had contained apple cider 60 seconds ago, and he had just looked up at a man he'd never officially met, and said 2 words with the calm certainty of someone who'd been carrying them in his pocket his entire life, waiting for the right person to hand them to. "Hi, Dad." Julian Sterling's glass hit marble. The sound cracked through that ballroom the way a rock cracks through a windshield. One sharp point of impact, and then fractures spreading in every direction at once. 400 conversations stopped mid-syllable. 400 champagne flutes froze mid-toast. And now he was standing 8 feet from us, with champagne pooling around his Italian shoes and his face going through something I will never forget as long as I draw breath. Not anger, not yet. That came later, behind a closed door, in a voice so quiet it cut deeper than shouting. Just confusion at first. His brain running 3 seconds behind his ears, replaying what he just heard because it couldn't possibly be right. Then his gaze dropped to Malik, traveled over the boy's forehead, his jaw, the way my son tilts his head slightly left when he's studying something new. Then came the recognition, and right behind it, the hurt, raw and deep and aimed directly at me, like a spotlight I couldn't step out of. Phones started lifting around the room. I could feel the whispers sliding from table to table like water finding cracks in a foundation. Somewhere near the bar, someone said, "Is that?" And someone else said, "Shh," and neither of them was quiet enough. Across the ballroom, through the silk gowns and tailored suits and champagne flutes frozen mid-air, a woman in an ivory column dress was already moving. Vivian Sterling, Julian's mother. She'd been standing near the stage preparing her welcome remarks. And now she was looking at Malik with an expression I recognized from 5 years ago. In a dining room I still see when I close my eyes. The same cold calculation, the same instant strategic adjustment, like she was watching a chess piece appear on the board that she hadn't accounted for, and was already 3 moves deep into her response. "Mommy, why is everybody looking at us?" I pulled Malik tighter against my hip. Instinct. 5 years of instinct. My pulse was so loud in my ears I almost missed his question. 5 years. 5 years of hiding and lying and building walls, and telling myself the secret was safe. And it had just been detonated by a kindergartner in a clip-on bow tie, who had recognized his own face on a stranger, and said the word I'd spent half a decade making sure he'd never have the chance to say. "I need you to understand something before you decide what kind of woman I am." I hid my billionaire ex's son from him for 5 years. Not in another country, not behind lawyers and fake names. I hid him in plain sight, in a shotgun house with my grandmother, on bus routes and tight budgets and grocery store math, in a life so ordinary that no one from Julian Sterling's world would ever think to look there. And it worked. For 5 years, it worked perfectly. Until tonight, until my babysitter canceled and my backup didn't answer. And every exit door closed one by one, until the only door left led straight into this ballroom. Until my son looked at the man I'd been running from, and said the word I'd been dreading, in the exact room, and at the exact moment. That would cause the maximum possible damage to the maximum number of people. So if you're already judging me, I get it. But if you'd been standing where I stood 5 years ago, in a dining room designed to make you feel small, staring at photographs that shattered everything you believed about the man you loved, listening to his phone ring at midnight and hearing a woman's voice where his should have been. You might have done exactly what I did. Would you? In that glass-sharp silence, with 400 eyes on me, and my son asking why everyone was staring, my mind did what minds do when the present becomes unbearable. It fled backward, fast and fractured, pulling up images I'd buried so deep I thought they'd composted into nothing. Julian at a hotel front desk 6 years ago with tired eyes and a rumpled linen shirt. Noticing me for the first time. A rooftop at sunset, his hands on my face, the city humming below us like it was holding its breath. His mother sliding a folder of photographs across a table so polished, I could see my own reflection in it, looking small and getting smaller. 2 pink lines on a test balanced on the edge of a bathroom counter I could barely afford. My grandmother holding a newborn boy in her arms, and whispering the name she'd chosen. Malik. King. All of that. 6 years of love and fear and pride and silence, packed into the space between one heartbeat and the next, while champagne seeped across marble, and a 5-year-old boy waited for me to explain why the whole world had gone quiet. The lilies. That's what dragged me under completely. The ballroom arrangements were white lilies in tall crystal vases on every table. And that smell hit me. And I wasn't standing in the Sterling Foundation ballroom anymore. I was 24 years old, pressing a blazer I couldn't afford to dry clean, tucking a ginger tea under the front desk counter at the Callaway Grand Hotel, and thinking that billionaires lived on another planet entirely. My grandmother raised me in a shotgun house in a neighborhood where the porches told you everything. You needed to know about the people behind the doors. Swept porches meant dignity. Cluttered porches meant someone had given up on being seen clearly. My grandmother's porch was swept every morning before the sun finished rising, regardless of weather, regardless of her knees, regardless of whether a single soul would walk past it that day. She had 3 rules stitched into every day, like thread through cotton. Pride is not something you talk about. It's something you live. You press your clothes even when no one's watching. You sweep the porch even when no one's coming. You stand straight even when the world is leaning on your shoulders so hard. You can feel your spine compressing under the weight. Keep your word. If you say you'll be somewhere, be there. If you say you'll do something, do it. Your word is the only currency that doesn't lose value. And the third one she said while stirring gravy on Sunday mornings with her back to me, like it was just another ingredient in the recipe: never let a rich man erase who you were before he found you. I didn't understand that last one until it was too late. Until I was standing in a borrowed car in a driveway longer than my entire street, staring at a house that wasn't a house, but a monument to the kind of wealth that doesn't just buy things, it buys the air around things. It buys silence. It buys disappearance. At 24, I was working the front desk of the Callaway Grand Hotel, the kind of place where the lobby alone cost more than my grandmother's house and everything in it. Crystal fixtures that caught the light and threw it around like the room was showing off for itself. Fresh flowers every morning. Lilies, always lilies, arranged by housekeeping in ceramic vases from a discount store, though the guests never would have guessed that. A doorman named Clive who'd been posted at those revolving doors for 31 years and could read a guest's mood by the speed of their stride across the threshold. The guests moved through that space like they owned the air itself, unhurried, handled, their luggage whisked away by bellhops before they'd finished their phone calls, their problems solved by concierge before they'd finished describing them, their entire existence cushioned by layers of people like me, who stayed invisible so their comfort could stay seamless. I was good at invisible. Excellent at it, actually. I knew every returning guest's preferred room temperature, pillow density, and minibar preference. I could untangle a billing dispute in under 4 minutes. While smiling so naturally, the guests believed they'd won the argument. I handled noise complaints, misplaced jewelry, jammed safes, and one memorable night, a guest's emotional support parrot that escaped into the elevator bank and took 45 minutes to coax down from a light fixture, using a granola bar and a calm voice that hid the fact that I was absolutely terrified of birds. I was competent, I was fast, and I was never going to be promoted. Because the Callaway liked their front desk staff to stay in a certain place? And I understood exactly where that place was, and what the borders looked like when you got close to them. I accepted it. The tips were decent. The hours let me take evening classes 2 nights a week at the community college, where I was slowly, stubbornly accumulating credits toward a degree I might never finish but refuse to abandon. My grandmother needed the stability of my steady paycheck more than I needed to chase something bigger. That was the whole picture. Neat. Contained. A life I could manage without holding my breath. That Tuesday in March, the lobby was quiet by 8. Business travelers already checked in, the restaurant humming softly through the far doors. Clive outside under the awning, scrolling his phone between arrivals. I had my ginger tea warming my hands and my novel open under the counter. Halfway through a chapter, and I was thinking about nothing more complicated than whether the plot twist on page 147 was earned or lazy, when a man set his bag down in front of me and said, "Checking in." Sterling. He didn't look like what I'd come to expect from the Callaways' wealthier guests. The men who usually booked penthouse suites had a finish to them. Polished, sealed, like they'd been lacquered by money, until nothing underneath could get through. This man looked genuinely tired. Not the glamorous exhaustion you see in magazine profiles, where the billionaire is photographed looking thoughtfully out a window. The real kind. His linen shirt was wrinkled from hours of sitting in a position that comfort had abandoned long ago. His watch was expensive but scuffed along the bezel, the kind of wear that comes from actually using something every day. Instead of rotating through a collection, his hair needed cutting. His eyes were focused somewhere behind me, like he was still finishing a thought from wherever he'd just come from, and hadn't fully arrived in the present yet. I pulled up his reservation. Penthouse suite, 4 nights, corporate account under Sterling Holdings, the name registered somewhere distant. Business magazines, the foundation logo on the lobby event board, donor lists for the hotel's annual charity auction. But I didn't connect it to anything personal. He was just another guest checking in late on a Tuesday. I gave him the standard welcome, restaurant hours, spa access code, concierge extension. He nodded through all of it without really listening, the way people do when they've heard identical information at 100 hotels in 100 cities and stopped needing any of it years ago. Then his gaze shifted downward, not to me, to the counter, to the spine of my paperback sticking out beside my hidden tea. He tilted his head, reading the title sideways, the way you do when you spot a book in someone else's hands. And curiosity overrides the politeness that says you shouldn't look. "Kindred," he said. Not a question. A recognition. "Yes, sir." Professional distance. Guest-facing voice. The voice I used to make sure the gap between us stayed visible and respected. "Butler's best work isn't her most famous one," he said, and for the first time he looked at me, not through me the way guests usually did, not past me toward the elevators or the concierge desk, or whatever destination was more important than the person handing them a key card. At me. Direct and quiet and without any of the performance I'd learned to expect from men in penthouse suites who wanted you to know they were cultured. But that one changes something in you, if you let it. He'd read the book. He'd actually sat with it. And he was saying something real about it to me, like I was a person whose response he genuinely wanted to hear. "It changed something in me 3 times, I said. "I keep rereading it because I figure I'm different enough each time to catch what I missed before." He smiled, tired but real. The first genuine expression I'd seen cross his face since he walked in. That's the best reason to reread anything. He picked up his key cards and walked to the elevators. And I told myself it meant nothing. A 30-second exchange about a novel. Guests talked to me all the time. It was part of the job. It meant absolutely nothing. The next morning he came down to the lobby at 6:15. Too early for the restaurant. Too early for the concierge. Too early for anyone to be around, except the overnight staff rotating out and me starting my shift, with my blazer freshly pressed and my tea freshly poured. He walked up to my counter carrying 2 cups from the cafe across the street. He set one in front of me without ceremony. On the side of the cup, in small, neat handwriting, he'd written, "For the woman who's been changed 3 times." I should have left it there. A thoughtful guest with good taste in books. A nice moment to remember during the slow hours. Nothing more. He kept coming back. Not every week. Sometimes 3 weeks would pass. Once, nearly 6. But the bookings kept appearing in the system. And he always requested the same floor. And he always found a reason to stop by the front desk. During the quiet hours when the lobby emptied out. And a real conversation could happen, without an audience of colleagues or guests who might read something into the exchange. We talked about books first, then about the city, the rain patterns, the way different bridges gave you different versions of the skyline, the hole-in-the-wall restaurants that tourists walked past, because the signage wasn't pretty enough. He told me about his father's company in careful fragments, the way you describe something you inherited but never chose, something that was placed on your shoulders before you were old enough to understand its weight or ask whether you wanted to carry it. He talked about board meetings the way a man talks about a language he's fluent in but doesn't love speaking. He mentioned his mother exactly once in those early weeks. She runs things. I show up. 5 words delivered so casually that I didn't hear the lock turning inside them. 5 words I should have recognized as a map to everything that would happen to us. I told him about my grandmother. The shotgun house. Saturday mornings spent hand-washing delicates. Because the machine was unreliable. And my grandmother believed certain fabrics deserved personal attention. Sunday hymns sung so loud the windows rattled. Because she was convinced that God didn't respond to whispering. And if you were going to ask the Almighty for something, you'd better make sure he could hear you over everybody else's requests. He laughed at that. A real laugh, unguarded and sudden. The kind of laugh that breaks free before the person knows it's coming. And I felt something shift in my chest that I recognized immediately as dangerous. I liked him. Not his money. Not his penthouse suite. Not the world he came from that I could see glinting behind every casual mention of flights and foundations. Him. The tired man with the scuffed watch who read novels and brought tea to strangers. And laughed like he'd forgotten he was allowed to. Then came the book. He checked in on a Friday evening, and when I handed him his key cards, he slid a package across the counter. Brown paper wrapping, my name written on it in that same neat handwriting from the teacup. Inside was a first edition, not Kindred, a different novel, one I'd mentioned wanting to read weeks earlier, but could never track down in the used bookstores I could afford. The cover was pristine. The pages smelled like old paper and careful storage. I held it like it was breathing. "You can't give me this," I said. "I already did." "Julian, it's a book, not a proposal." He was smiling. "Read it and tell me what you think. That's all I want." I read it in 2 days. I told him what I thought on his next visit. Standing at the front desk at 11 at night, while the lobby was empty, and the only sound was the distant hum of the ice machine on the second floor. We talked for an hour. Then 2. He leaned against the counter. And I forgot he was a guest, and he forgot I was staff. And for those hours, we were just 2 people who'd read the same book and couldn't stop turning it over between us. Finding new angles, disagreeing about the ending, building an argument out of thin air, and then knocking it down and building another one. 2 weeks after that, he took me to the rooftop. Staff weren't allowed up there. It was a maintenance access point with an unfinished view. That management kept locked, because it wasn't landscaped or furnished or chargeable to a guest's account. But Julian moved through restricted spaces, with a quiet certainty that barriers simply didn't apply to him. Not arrogance, just an assumption that doors would open when he reached for them. And they did. The city was laid out below us like something alive, glowing and humming and stretching to the horizon in every direction. The air smelled like warm concrete and rain that hadn't arrived yet. And somewhere far below a food cart was selling something with cumin and garlic. That drifted up to us in waves. He told me he couldn't stop thinking about me. Not with grand gestures or rehearsed speeches. He said it plainly, like he was reporting the findings of an experiment he'd tried to control and failed. He said he knew the gap between our worlds was real, and that he'd thought carefully about whether his attention was welcome, or just tolerated because of who he was. He said if I told him to stop coming to the Callaway, he would stop. No consequences. No questions. No sudden restructuring of front desk staff at the next quarterly board meeting. I should have told him to stop. Instead, I kissed him. or he kissed me. I honestly don't remember who moved first. I just remember his hands on my face, and the skyline behind us, and the feeling of stepping out of my old life, without understanding what I was walking into. What felt like freedom was actually the first step into a world with rules I couldn't see, and consequences I couldn't imagine, and a woman I hadn't met yet, who was already, I would later learn, fully aware of my existence. 8 months, that's how long I lived in Julian Sterling's world. He flew me to Cape Town for my birthday. We spent 3 days in a house on the coast, with windows that went floor to ceiling, and a view of the Atlantic. That made me understand for the first time why rich people talked about perspective, like it was something you could buy. We ate at a restaurant where the waiter knew Julian by name, and the wine cost more than my weekly grocery budget, and I had to excuse myself to the bathroom once, because I needed 60 seconds alone to process the vertigo of existing in 2 economic realities at the same time. We spent Saturday afternoons in art galleries, where he'd stand behind me while I stared at paintings I couldn't pronounce the names of, and he'd whisper the artist's biography in my ear like it was a secret just for me. I told him once that a particular painting looked like it was holding its breath, and he stared at it for a full minute and said, "I've been looking at art my whole life, and I've never once thought to ask whether a painting was breathing." His penthouse was enormous and silent until I was in it. Then I'd hum while making tea in his kitchen. And he told me once that my humming was the only sound. That made his apartment feel like a place where someone actually lived, instead of a showroom designed to impress people he didn't actually like. He remembered everything. My tea preferences down to the steeping time, the songs I hummed without thinking, the fact that I always turned the television off before sleep, because my grandmother said screens in the bedroom invited bad dreams. He remembered that I liked my eggs scrambled soft and my toast barely brown, and that I read the last page of every novel first, because I needed to know the ending was safe before I could enjoy the middle. When he was overwhelmed, after 16-hour days of shareholder calls and boardroom arguments that left invisible bruises you could only see in the set of his jaw, he wouldn't talk about it. He'd just find me wherever I was in the apartment, and press his forehead against mine, and breathe, like I was the only fixed point in a world that kept spinning too fast. For him to find his footing, sometimes we'd stay like that for minutes, not speaking, just breathing together, in the enormous silence of a penthouse that cost more than most people's houses. And in those moments, the money didn't exist. The board seats didn't exist. His last name didn't exist. We were just 2 people who'd found each other, and were holding on. I loved him. Not the money, not the penthouse, not Cape Town, the man who scuffed his watch and read novels and brought tea with notes on the cup. I loved him completely, and with the dangerous totality that only comes from believing. At 24, that love is large enough to override any obstacle, including the ones you can't see yet. But his money changed the scale of every consequence, and the signs were already there if I'd known how to read them. A colleague at the Callaway who saw me leave with Julian one evening, and started treating me differently the next morning. Not cruelly, just with a new awareness, like I'd been reclassified from colleague to curiosity. A woman at a fundraiser Julian brought me to, who looked at me, then looked at him, then looked back at me, with an expression that performed the entire math of our relationship in 2 seconds, and found the answer unsatisfying. Staff who'd been perfectly pleasant for years suddenly had a new edge in their voices, something between amusement and pity. That told me they believed they understood my situation better than I did. And then, through a glass-walled conference room, I watched Julian become someone I barely recognized. Smaller, careful with his words, deferring on every point to the woman at the head of the table. A woman I hadn't met, but whose posture alone told me everything about who actually held power at Sterling Holdings. She sat the way people sit when they've been at the head of tables for so long, that the head of the table follows them wherever they choose to sit. His mother, he told me about his father one night, late, a glass of something amber in his hand, and his voice flattened in the way voices get when they're describing damage they've absorbed so deeply. It's become part of their own geography. His father drank, not socially, not occasionally, steadily and completely, the way some people leave a room without standing up, just slowly disappearing from the inside. Julian said his mother stepped in when his father couldn't function anymore, that she'd held the company together through force of will, that without her, the Sterling name would have dissolved into debt and public embarrassment. He said it with gratitude, but underneath the gratitude was something that sounded like a door that had been locked for a very long time, a door he walked past every day without testing the handle, because he already knew what was behind it and had decided it was safer to leave it closed. He spoke of his mother the way people speak about forces of nature, with respect, with obedience, and with a careful distance that looked exactly like fear. I should have asked more about what saved really meant, about why a grown man deferred to his mother in a boardroom. Like a child awaiting permission, I didn't ask. I was in love, and I was 24, and I believed that love was large enough to make the questions unnecessary. Then the invitation arrived, not from Julian. That was the first thing I noticed. It came on cream stationery so thick it felt like cardstock, embossed with the Sterling family crest, addressed to me by my full legal name, a name I had never given to anyone in Julian's world. A formal lunch at the Sterling estate. Saturday, noon. Julian mentioned it casually. She wants to meet you. It's a good sign. The iron gates opened slowly, like they were deciding whether to let me through. The driveway was longer than my entire street, and the house wasn't a house. It was a statement. Stone and glass and silence. The kind of architecture that doesn't welcome you. It measures you. It watches you walk from the car to the front door, and it calculates whether you belong there before you've touched the handle. I parked the borrowed car. I smoothed my dress. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror and saw my grandmother's face looking back at me, which is what always happens when I'm nervous. I default to her features, her jaw, her steady eyes. Never let a rich man erase who you were before he found you. I stepped through the front door anyway. The dining room looked like it belonged in a museum, not the kind you visit on school field trips, where everything is interactive and approachable, the kind with rope barriers and climate control, and a feeling that even the air has been arranged by someone with very specific opinions about how things should be. Orchids in low crystal bowls running the length of the table, floors so polished they reflected the ceiling, a table long enough to seat 14 but set for two, one at the head, one to its right. Close enough for conversation, close enough to be studied. Vivian Sterling was already seated when the housekeeper walked me in. She stood to greet me, and I took in everything at once. Clothes that fit like they'd been constructed directly onto her frame. The single strand of pearls at her throat. That probably cost more than my annual salary. The smile that arrived at her mouth and stopped precisely before reaching her eyes. Nia, I'm so glad you could come. She said my name like she'd rehearsed the pronunciation. Not warmly, accurately. Lunch arrived on white plates with portions arranged like gallery installations. Roasted something with a sauce I couldn't identify. And greens that tasted like they'd been cultivated. Specifically for this meal and this table and this moment, Vivian asked polite questions. Where I grew up, where I went to school, how long I'd worked at the Callaway. She listened to each answer with the attentive tilt of someone filing information rather than absorbing it. Each response I gave felt like a document being placed into a folder she'd already labeled. Then she set down her fork. Precisely, in the center of her plate. I want you to know I think you're lovely, she said. Julian clearly enjoys your company, and I can see why. You're bright, you're composed, you carry yourself well for someone in your position. For someone in your position. 5 words that did more work than a whole paragraph. But I've been Julian's mother for 31 years, she continued. And I've watched him go through these phases before. He fixates. He romanticizes. He forgets that the world he lives in has boundaries that exist for very real reasons. And when the fixation fades, and it always fades, Nia, the person left standing in the wreckage is never him. It's always the other one. I kept my hands in my lap. Still, flat. My grandmother taught me that when someone is trying to knock you off balance, you keep your hands quiet and let your spine do the talking. I appreciate your concern, I said, but Julian and I are adults, and our relationship is between us. She smiled again. That same calibrated expression. Of course it is. I'm simply offering context. Then she reached beside her chair and placed a folder on the table between us. Cream-colored, unmarked. She slid it toward me with 2 fingers. The way you'd pass someone a menu you've already memorized? Context, she repeated. I opened it. Photographs. High quality. Printed on heavy paper. Julian at events I'd never heard of. Galas, fundraisers, rooftop dinners in cities I didn't recognize. And, in each photograph, a different woman. His hand resting on the small of someone's back. His easy laugh directed at someone's upturned face. The same gestures I'd believed were mine. The lean in. The direct eye contact. The way he touched the space between a woman's shoulder blades. Like he was reading something written there. One photograph stopped me cold. Dated 3 weeks after our Cape Town trip. A fundraiser downtown. The woman beside him was tall and striking. And she was looking at him the way I looked at him. And he was looking right back. My chest went hollow. I don't show you these to be cruel, Vivian said, her voice carrying the practiced softness of someone who has delivered devastation many times and refined the delivery into an art form. I show you because someone should have shown them to you months ago. Julian is generous with his attention. It's one of his better qualities in business, and one of his worst in personal matters. You are not the first woman to believe she was the only one. You won't be the last. I stared at the photographs. My hands were no longer still. What do you want? I asked. My voice came out flat. Good. Flat was better than breaking. She placed 2 more items on the table, one at a time, each with its own silence. First, a check, for an amount that would have cleared my grandmother's property taxes for a decade, eliminated my student debt, and left a cushion thick enough to breathe inside for a year. I stared at the number, and felt something I can only describe as vertigo. The specific dizziness that comes from understanding that a problem you've spent years struggling with could be solved by a single piece of paper. That means nothing to the person who wrote it. Then a document. 3 pages of legal language I couldn't fully parse in the moment. But I understood its shape. A clean exit. No future contact. No public statements. No claims of any kind against Julian or the Sterling family. Permanent. Binding. A door that locked from the outside. I want to protect my son, Vivian said. From himself, if necessary. His father fell apart over the wrong woman. It nearly destroyed everything I spent 20 years building. I won't watch history repeat itself. She paused. Let that settle into the silence between us. Then she leaned forward. Just slightly. And her voice didn't change at all. Which made what came next worse. Your grandmother's property taxes are overdue again this year. 3rd time in 5, if I'm not mistaken. The same measured cadence. The same perfect posture. I worry about that. Losing a family home at her age would be terribly difficult. My throat tightened. And the Callaway board meets quarterly, she continued, lifting her water glass with a hand so steady. It could have been bolted to her wrist. Sterling Holdings has had a seat on that board for 11 years. We've always valued consistency in staffing. But restructuring happens. Positions get evaluated. She took a delicate sip. Set the glass down without a sound. I mention this not as a threat, of course. Just as landscape. Just as landscape. I looked at the check. I looked at the photographs. I looked at this woman who had invited me into her home. Fed me a beautiful lunch. And then systematically removed every safe surface from my life, while smiling like she was performing a kindness. I didn't touch the check. I didn't sign the document. But I took the photographs. I stood up. My chair made no sound on that polished floor, because even the furniture in this house had been trained to be quiet. I said, "Thank you for lunch," with a voice I kept level through sheer stubbornness. I walked out through the long hallway with its paintings that cost more than my street, past the housekeeper who wouldn't meet my eyes, through the front door and down the endless driveway, to the borrowed car that suddenly felt like the only honest thing within a mile. I sat in that car for 11 minutes before I could drive. I know because I watched the dashboard clock, while my hands shook against the steering wheel, and my mind played those photographs on a loop behind my eyes. The women, the gestures, The laugh I thought belonged to me, given freely to strangers at events I never knew existed. But the photographs weren't the thing that shattered me. That night I called Julian. First try, voicemail. His voice on the recording, warm, unhurried, the same voice that read to me on quiet Sunday mornings. While I lay in his bed with my head on his chest, felt like hearing someone speak from behind glass. Close and completely untouchable. I was sitting on the edge of my bed in my grandmother's house, the same bed I'd slept in as a child, when storms kept me awake, and the thunder sounded like the sky was breaking apart. The photographs were spread across the quilt beside me like evidence at a trial. And I was giving him one chance, one ring, one voice that was his and no one else's, telling me that Vivian was lying, and that the photographs meant nothing, and that I was the only one. I called again, my thumb hovering over the screen, every ring stretching longer than the last. Second ring, I pressed the phone harder against my ear. Third ring, I could feel my heartbeat in my fingers. Fourth ring, I was already assembling what I'd say when he picked up. The photographs, Julian. Your mother showed me photographs. Tell me they don't mean what she said they mean. A click, and a voice that wasn't his. A woman's voice. Sleepy, annoyed at the late hour, comfortable enough in his space to answer his phone. Without thinking twice about it, familiar with his bedroom in a way that only comes from being there often enough. That the phone on his nightstand feels like an extension of her own reach. He's in the shower. Can I take a message? I hung up. I sat on that bed, holding the photographs in one hand, and my dead silent phone in the other, and I assembled everything into a single picture. The women, the gestures, Vivian's calm certainty that I was just one in a rotation, the voice on the phone, the shower, a woman comfortable enough in his space to answer his calls at midnight. The picture added up to one conclusion, and I built it with the speed and certainty of someone who has already been shown the blueprint and is just snapping the last pieces into place. I was a chapter in Julian Sterling's ongoing story, a pleasant sidebar his mother was now editing out, with professional precision, the way you remove a paragraph that doesn't serve the larger narrative. Something inside me that had been holding on, one last stubborn thread of belief, that maybe the photographs were staged, and maybe Vivian was wrong, and maybe I was the exception, to whatever pattern his mother had identified, snapped clean. I went to his penthouse the next day while he was at the office. I still had the key card. I packed my things into a canvas bag, my books, my tea tin, a sweater, a pair of earrings my grandmother had given me for my 21st birthday. It took less than 15 minutes. 8 months of my life, and it fit into a bag I could carry on the bus. I stood in his kitchen for a moment before I left. The counter, where I'd made tea. The spot where I'd leaned while he talked about board meetings he hated. The window where the city lights stretched to the horizon. And I'd once believed I was looking at the future. I didn't leave a note. I wanted to. I drafted half a dozen versions in my head, while I folded that sweater, but I knew with absolute certainty that if I left words behind, Julian would find me with an explanation, and his explanations would be specific and tender. And I would believe them, because I wanted to believe them, more than I wanted to trust the evidence in front of me. That was the most dangerous part. Not that he would lie, but that I'd let him tell me a truth I preferred, over the one his mother had just documented on heavy photographic paper. So I left silence instead. My grandmother saw me come through the door with the canvas bag. She didn't ask what happened. She made tea. She pulled the quilt off the back of the couch. She sat beside me and held my hand, the way she'd held it when I was 9 and my mother left for good, firm and warm, and without any false promises that things would get easier. We just didn't work out, I told her. She looked at me for a long time. She didn't believe me, but she loved me enough to let me have the lie for now. I changed my phone number 3 days later, not because Julian was calling, because I was terrified of what I'd do if he did. Because at 2 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, I could feel the pull toward his number like gravity, and the only way to protect myself from my own weakness was to make the bridge impossible to cross. 5 weeks after I walked out of that penthouse, I was kneeling on the bathroom floor of my grandmother's house. At 6 in the morning, staring at a plastic test balanced on the edge of the counter. 2 pink lines. What went through my mind wasn't panic. It wasn't joy. It wasn't the version of this moment you see in movies, where a woman puts her hand over her mouth and cries or smiles, or calls her best friend. It was a series of doors opening and slamming shut so fast. I could feel the wind from each one. Door 1. Call Julian. Tell him. He has a right to know. That door opened directly onto Vivienne's dining room. The folder. The check. The threats about the house and my job. If I told Julian, Vivienne would know within hours. And a woman willing to threaten my grandmother's home and my employment over a relationship would do far worse over a grandchild she'd view as a complication to be managed or erased. Door 2. Don't call. Raise this child alone. Keep the Sterling name out of it entirely. That door opened onto years of exhaustion. Single income. No safety net beyond my grandmother. A child who would eventually ask questions I couldn't answer honestly. A lifetime of looking over my shoulder. Door 3. Vivienne's check. Her money. Take it and start over somewhere far away. That door I slammed so hard it rattled my teeth. Never her money. My grandmother's voice rang through me like a bell. Pride is lived, not spoken. I chose door 2. Sitting on cold tile with my back against the tub, and my hand flat on my stomach. And the most complicated emotion I'd ever experienced moving through me? Love for someone I hadn't met yet. Braided together with grief for someone I'd just lost. Threaded through with a fear so deep, it didn't feel like an emotion anymore. It felt like weather, something that had moved in, and would take a long, long time to clear. I kept the baby. I did not call Julian. I told myself I was protecting my child. That the Sterling world was a machine designed to process inconvenient people, quietly and thoroughly, and that my baby would become the most inconvenient person of all. I told myself Vivienne's threats proved what kind of family this was, that no amount of Julian's gentleness could outweigh his mother's reach. And maybe it was all of those things, but if I'm being honest, and I'm trying to be honest now because that's the whole point of telling you this, it was also fear. My own fear making the decision, and calling itself protection, because protection sounds braver than hiding.
Nia had every reason to be afraid. The threats were real. The photographs looked damning. The voice on the phone sounded exactly like what Vivienne wanted it to sound like. But she never called back. She never put those photographs on the table in front of Julian and said, "Explain these." She never gave him the chance to say, "That's my cousin," or "That's a donor I met twice." And this is how the most effective lies work. They're not built out of fiction. They're built out of carefully chosen facts. Every photograph was real. The voice on the phone was a real woman in his real apartment. Vivienne didn't invent a single thing. She just decided which truths Nia would see and which ones she wouldn't. And then she let fear do the rest. That's worth sitting with. Drop a comment and tell me, if someone showed you photographs like that, would you call back? Or would you do what Nia did? Subscribe so you don't miss what that decision costs her. Because the price is about to get very specific.
My grandmother named him. She held him the day he arrived, and whispered the name like she was placing something precious and permanent on his head. Malik King. She said a boy should know his worth from his very first breath, especially a boy whose father wouldn't be there to remind him. He looked like Julian from the start. Same forehead, same jaw, same way his face shifted when something caught his attention. A slight narrowing of the eyes, a tilt of the head, an expression that said, "I see you and I'm deciding what to do about it." I'd be up with him at 3 in the morning, exhausted and sore, and holding him against my chest, and I'd look down and see Julian's features, looking back at me from this tiny, perfect face. And the ground would shift under every justification I'd built for doing this alone. I picked up extra shifts, applied for assistance programs, filled out forms that asked for the father's name, and wrote unknown in the blank, which was technically true because Julian didn't know, and also the largest lie I'd ever committed to paper. I budgeted down to the dollar, learned which grocery store discounted produce on which evening, became fluent in the mathematics of barely enough, raising Malik without sterling money, living inside a budget so tight that any unexpected expense felt like a small emergency. When he was 3, his pediatrician noticed something with his left eye, a tracking issue that needed a specialist. $400 after insurance. Follow up another $200. Corrective exercises that were free, but required daily repetition and time I didn't have, because I was splitting hours between the Callaway and weekend catering shifts to patch the hole the specialist had punched in our savings. My grandmother did the exercises with him every afternoon, sitting in her recliner with Malik on a stool in front of her, guiding his focus with a penlight, and a patience that seemed to come from somewhere bottomless. Her own knees were getting worse, stairs were becoming negotiations, and the property tax bill arrived every spring, like a creditor who never forgot your address. But she did those exercises every single day, because that's who she was. You show up. You do what needs doing. You don't talk about what it costs you. I told myself this struggle was the price of independence. This was what freedom from the Sterlings looked like. Not pretty, not comfortable, but ours. Every dollar I earned was clean. Every meal I put on that table came from my own hands, and no one, not Vivian, not Julian, not anyone from that world of polished floors and curated photographs, could hold it over me or threaten to take it away. That's what I told myself. Most days, I even believed it. Malik grew, fast and curious and full of questions about everything he encountered. Why the sky changed colors, why birds stood on one leg, why his grandmother's knee clicked when she stood up from her recliner. He was 3 when he started noticing that other kids had something he didn't. Not because anyone pointed it out, because the world is full of clues when you're a child who pays close attention, and my son paid attention to everything. It started with small things. A cartoon where the dad character carried his kid on his shoulders. Malik would go quiet during those scenes. Not sad exactly, just still. The way he got when he was processing something he didn't have a category for yet. A boy at the playground whose father pushed him on the swings, while Malik watched from the top of the slide, with an expression I couldn't quite read, but could feel in the pit of my stomach. A picture he drew in preschool, 3 stick figures holding hands, labeled in wobbly letters. Me. Mommy. Grandma. His teacher mentioned that most of the other children drew 4 figures. She said it gently, like she was handing me something fragile. I took it home and put it on the refrigerator, and looked at it every morning while the coffee brewed, and felt something tighten behind my ribs. That never fully released. I told myself he was fine. Kids adapt. Kids fill gaps with imagination and love and routine. And we had routine. We had routine down to a science. Sunday evenings were ours. Malik sat between my knees on the living room floor, while I worked oil through his hair, and he'd launch questions at me like a talk show host warming up a crowd. Why do clouds move if nobody pushes them? Why does peanut butter stick to the roof of your mouth, but jelly slides right off? Why does Grandma talk to the plants like they understand her? What's the biggest number? And is there a number after that one? I lived for those evenings. His small back warm against my shins, the smell of the oil on my fingertips, his voice bouncing from topic to topic, while the television murmured low in the background, and my grandmother hummed hymns from the kitchen, off-key and unapologetic. But underneath the warmth, I was always bracing. Every Sunday, every bath time, every quiet car ride home from preschool, when Malik would stare out the window, and I could almost hear his brain organizing things into categories, filing observations, building toward a question I knew was coming, the way you know a storm is building, not because anyone tells you, but because the pressure changes. He was 4.5 when he asked it directly. We were in the kitchen. He was sitting on the counter. I know he shouldn't have been on the counter, but he loved being up high, where he could survey everything like a general on a hilltop, and I'd stopped fighting that particular battle. Somewhere around his 3rd birthday, he had apple slices arranged in a fan pattern on a small plate, with a blob of peanut butter in the center. He was eating them one by one, methodical and focused. Dip, bite, chew, reach for the next slice, with the concentration he brought to everything. Mommy, Where's my daddy? Not why don't I have one? Not the general philosophical version of the question, the specific one. Where, as if his father was a location on a map that someone had simply forgotten to point out to him. I set down the dish I was drying. Took a breath that I prayed sounded casual. Some questions have answers that aren't ready yet, I said. Like when you plant a seed. And it needs time underground before anything comes up. The answer is in there. It's just not ready to show itself. He chewed his apple slice. Considered this with the gravity of a philosopher, evaluating a new proposition. Nodded once. Okay. Can I have more peanut butter? He accepted it. Because he was 4.5. And he trusted me with the kind of completeness that only small children are capable of. Total, unquestioning, absolute. When your mother tells you something isn't ready yet, you believe her. Why would she lie? I turned back to the sink so he wouldn't see my face. Because the guilt landed so hard, I had to grip the edge of the counter with both hands. I wasn't protecting him. I was stealing from him. Every single day, I kept this secret. I was reaching into my son's life and removing something that belonged to him, his history, his father, his right to know where half of himself came from. But I didn't know how to give it back, without the rest of the structure collapsing. So I kept taking, and I got better at it. And the better I got at it, the worse I felt about how good I'd become. He found the photograph when he was 4, the only one I'd kept, from the rooftop, slightly blurry, taken on Julian's phone, and texted to me the same night, the two of us laughing at something I can't remember anymore. The skyline behind us streaked with orange and pink. I'd printed it at a drugstore kiosk and tucked it into my nightstand drawer, underneath old birthday cards and a broken watch I kept meaning to repair. Malik was sitting cross-legged on my bedroom floor, with the drawer pulled open, holding it carefully in both hands, studying it with total absorption, head tilted, lips slightly parted, eyes moving across the image like he was reading a sentence, in a language he almost understood. "Who's this?" he asked, holding it up. "Just an old friend," I said, taking it gently from his fingers. "From before you were born." He watched me close the drawer, with an expression that told me he was cataloging this moment, filing it, not forgetting, not accepting my answer as complete, saving it. 6 months later, at the Lenox Square food court, Saturday afternoon, Malik with chicken nuggets arranged biggest to smallest. Because he organized everything. A television mounted above the smoothie kiosk, playing a business segment nobody was expected to actually watch. Julian's face appeared on the screen. An interview about a Sterling Holdings acquisition. Malik's hand froze mid-reach for a chicken nugget. "Mommy." He pointed at the screen with the nugget still in his fist. "That man looks like me." Every muscle in my body locked. "He doesn't, baby. Eat your lunch." "Yes, he does. He's got my same face." He said it the way children state obvious things, that adults have decided to pretend aren't obvious. The sky is blue. Water is wet. That man on the television has my face. I deployed every distraction. The play area. Promised ice cream. They worked on the surface, but I saw the filing motion behind his eyes. Before he let it go, another piece cataloged. A photograph in a drawer, a face on a screen. 2 fragments stored in his private archive, waiting for enough pieces to form a picture I couldn't control. The walls were thinning. The world kept offering my son the truth in pieces, and I was running out of ways to cover the cracks.
People think secrets explode, that one day the truth just detonates and everything falls apart at once. That's not how it works. Secrets shrink your life. Slowly, quietly, one closed door at a time. Every lie Nia told was a door closing behind her, not in front of her. Behind her. She could never go back to the moment before the lie. She could only keep moving forward, into a space that was getting narrower and narrower. The babysitter who might ask questions, closed door. The school forms that needed a father's name, closed door. A son watching a television screen and saying that man looks like me, closed door. Eventually, you've closed so many doors behind you that there's only one left. And it leads straight into the thing you've been running from. That's where Nia is right now. One door left. Subscribe because she's about to walk through it.
I left the Callaway 7 years after I'd started. Not because of the Sterlings. By then the connection felt distant enough to be manageable. I left because a boutique hotel in Midtown offered me a manager position, 32 rooms, a real title on my name tag, a salary that meant our monthly budget finally had a margin instead of just an edge. For the first time in Malik's life, an unexpected expense wouldn't require me to rearrange everything else like a puzzle with one piece too many. The owner was a woman named Constance, who moved through the city's charity and donor circles with ease, and expected her staff to do the same. The hotel hosted events, catered to clientele that valued discretion and personal attention. Reputation mattered. She'd hired me because I understood luxury hospitality from the inside out, and cost half what someone from a larger brand would charge. I knew I was a bargain, but the title was real, and the benefits were real. And sometimes being undervalued in a better position is still better than being invisible in the old one. Then Constance appeared in my office doorway on a Wednesday afternoon, with her reading glasses pushed up into her hair, and the kind of expression that meant this wasn't a request, an envelope, thick cream paper, embossed, the Sterling Foundation Annual Gala. My stomach dropped the moment I read the name. They invited every boutique property in Midtown, Constance said. Networking opportunity. The donor tier at this event is exactly the clientele we're trying to reach. I'm not sure I can make that evening work, I said, already hearing how thin it sounded. It's not optional, Nia. Kind, but final. The way people speak, when the decision has already been made, and the conversation is just a courtesy. Wear something appropriate. Bring business cards. Make connections. She walked away. I sat at my desk and stared at the invitation. The Sterling crest. The same crest embossed on the stationery Vivian had used to summon me 5 years earlier. I could feel the paper's weight pressing against my fingers. Like a warning. I could refuse. Call in sick. Quit the job entirely. But Malik's eye specialist had a follow-up next month. Property taxes due in April, and this job, this one good job with a real title and real benefits, and a margin in the budget, was the first genuinely stable ground I'd stood on in years. I couldn't afford to refuse. The morning of the gala, my babysitter called at 2 in the afternoon. Her mother had taken a fall. She was at the hospital. I called my backup. Voicemail. Called a neighbor. Out of state. Called my grandmother, 8 weeks past hip surgery. Navigating the house with a walker. Bring him with you. He'll sit quiet. You taught that boy how to behave in any room. To a gala, Grandma. A Sterling Foundation gala. Then dress him nice. And leave early. Every door closed. Every single one. I put Malik in his navy suit from preschool graduation. He clipped his bow tie on himself. He loved that bow tie because it snapped on with a satisfying click. That made him feel like a secret agent. He stood in the hallway mirror and adjusted it 3 times. Chin lifted, grinning. I matched the grown-ups, he said. I looked at him in that suit and saw Julian so clearly. It made my chest ache. The posture, the serious little mouth that could break into sudden radiance, the way he stood with his weight slightly forward, leaning into whatever came next. My boy, my king, about to walk into a room where his entire life could change, and he didn't know it. He was just excited about the bow tie. Chandeliers so large they looked like they were holding the ceiling up. The string quartet in the corner. Perfume mixing until the air itself felt expensive. 400 people who inhabited this world naturally. The way fish inhabit water. I spotted Vivian near the stage. Ivory dress, 5 years older, no less formidable. Her eyes swept the room the way a general surveys terrain. She hadn't seen us yet. I found the quietest spot near the back wall with Malik. Sparkling apple cider and a champagne flute. That made him feel important and grown. This is fancy, Mommy, he whispered. Very fancy. We're not staying long, but Malik needed a refill. The refreshment table was on the other side of the room. Open ground. Move fast, eyes down, get the drink, get back to the wall, get out. We made it to the table. Malik reached for the cider with both hands. I kept my back to the crowd, kept my eyes on him. Nia, one word. From behind me. And I knew that voice the way you know a sound, that lives in your body rather than your memory, not by thinking about it, but by feeling it land in your chest, before your brain has time to catch up. I turned around. Julian was standing 3 feet away, and before I could speak, before I could do anything at all, my son who had been collecting fragments for years, a photograph in a drawer, a face on a screen, pieces he'd been assembling in his quiet, organized mind, looked up at the man in front of him, with those eyes, Julian's eyes, and completed the picture. "Hi, Dad," he said it calmly, like he'd been carrying those words his whole life, and had finally found the right person to hand them to. Julian's champagne glass slipped from his fingers. It hit the marble floor, and the sound cut through the ballroom like a blade through fabric. The string quartet stopped. Conversations within 30 feet went silent mid-sentence. 400 heads turned toward the source. "Mommy, why is everybody looking at us?" Security materialized. A woman in a headset. A man with an earpiece. Containment. "Come with me," Julian said. "Not to the staff. To me." A service hallway. Carpet cleaner and warming trays. A very important person room with leather chairs and drawn curtains. And silence so complete it felt pressurized. 8 feet between us. 5 years filling every inch. How old is he? Flat. Controlled. 5. He turned 5 in February. He counted backward. The math landed on his face like a physical weight. "What's his name?" "Malik." He repeated it quietly, testing the shape of it, learning a word that should have been one of the first he ever spoke to his own child. "Is he mine, Nia?" Malik was in my arms, with Julian's own eyes looking back at us both, lying in front of my son about who his father was. Would have been a betrayal so deep. It would have poisoned everything I'd built, including the parts I was proud of. "Yes, he's yours?" Julian's face came apart, not dramatically, the way a wall looks right before it gives way, still standing, but no longer holding anything. 5 years. You kept my son from me for 5 years. I had reasons. Reasons? Hollow, like a container with nothing inside. Your mother. I told him everything. The lunch, the orchids and the too long table, and Vivian's precise smile. The photographs, the check, the threats about my grandmother's house and my job. And the midnight phone call. His number, a woman's voice. The shower. Julian listened without moving. Then his expression settled on something dark and focused. "I never cheated on you. Not once. Not with anyone." The photographs were taken at business events. PR appearances where I stood next to people I barely knew. Because my publicist said physical proximity projected warmth. Some were taken before I ever met you. And the phone call? The woman at midnight? He searched his memory. Then something landed. Drea, my cousin. Her lease collapsed, and she stayed in my guest room for about a week. She answers anything that rings. Phone, intercom, door. She thinks she's being helpful. It never occurred to me to mention it. Because she's family, his cousin, the foundation I'd built 5 years of decisions on. Cracked beneath me. The photographs were curated. The phone call was a cousin. Vivian hadn't shown me the truth about Julian. She'd constructed a version designed to make me leave, and I'd accepted it, without giving the man I loved a single chance to explain. 5 years, Julian's voice fractured. First words, first steps. His first day of school. You chose his name without me. You built his entire world without me in it. Your mother threatened everything I had, and you believed her. Over me. Malik squirmed. "Mommy, am I in trouble?" Both of us looked at him, and the anger moved aside. Our son was frightened. "No, baby. You're not in any trouble at all." Julian knelt. "Not even a little bit, buddy. Grown-ups sometimes talk about complicated things, and it sounds scary, but none of it is about you." Malik studied Julian's face from 18 inches away. "Are you really my dad?" Julian looked up at me. I nodded. Yeah, he said softly. I am. Cool. Is there more apple cider? The door opened. Vivienne entered with a PR handler. Composed. Expression arranged. This is a delicate family matter. We need to manage this carefully. Mother, not now. Julian, the foundation's reputation. I said now. In 8 months of watching Julian with his mother, I had never once seen him interrupt her. This was new territory, and Vivienne recognized it the way a chess player recognizes an unexpected move, with surprise quickly masked by strategic adjustment. No statements, I said. The room turned to me. My son is not a press asset. If there's a paternity question, we do it through a DNA test at a neutral clinic I select. With legal protections in writing, Malik stays out of every headline, every photo, every public conversation. Perhaps we should discuss this at the estate. I'm not coming to your estate, Nia. I'm simply trying to facilitate. You've facilitated enough? Vivienne turned to Julian for the alliance she'd relied on. For 31 years. He didn't give it. She's right. Neutral clinic, her terms. He's my son. Decisions about him are between me and his mother. Not PR, not anyone else in this room. Vivienne smoothed her dress, adjusted her pearls. Of course. Family first. She said it the way a chess player says your move.
Julian interrupted his mother. In 8 months, Nia never saw him do that. Not once. He deferred. He complied. He went along. And tonight, with his son in the room, he said, not now. And then he said her terms. But watch what Vivienne did when he drew that line. She didn't argue. She didn't threaten. She smoothed her dress, adjusted her pearls, and said, of course, family first. That's not surrender. That's patience. She's been managing Julian for 31 years. She's not worried about one moment of rebellion. She knows how this works. You let the defiance happen. You let it feel brave. And then you wait for the old patterns to pull him back. The question is whether Julian is strong enough to stay on the other side of that line, or whether 30 years of habit are stronger than 2 weeks of fatherhood. Subscribe if you want to find out, because the DNA results are about to arrive.
And that's when Vivienne stops being patient. She left. The PR man followed. Julian and I stood in the quiet she left behind, and neither of us knew what to say next. We were in territory that had no map, just 2 people who had loved each other once, and wounded each other deeply, and now shared a boy. Who was asking if the leather chairs spun around? We should go, I said. He's tired. Julian nodded. He looked like a man with 1,000 words trapped behind his teeth, and no way to arrange them. I'll have my lawyer send testing arrangements to whatever contact you want. Your terms? I found a pen on the conference table and wrote my email on a Sterling Foundation napkin. I handed it to him, and our fingers touched for half a second. And I pulled away, and he noticed, and we both pretended it hadn't happened. I carried Malik out through the service hallway, through a side exit to avoid the ballroom, and into the parking garage. The night air hit my face, and I realized I'd been holding my breath for 20 minutes. I strapped Malik into his car seat. He was asleep before I closed the door. I stood beside the car with my palms flat on the roof, and breathed. Across the garage, near the exit ramp, 2 figures stood with cameras, not close, not aggressive, but positioned, waiting, like they'd been expecting something worth capturing, to emerge from those doors. My phone buzzed. An email from a Sterling Holdings legal address, subject line, DNA testing protocol, confidential. They'd drafted the paperwork. In the time it took me to walk to my car, I sat in that parking garage with my sleeping son behind me, and my whole life rearranging itself. And I understood something with perfect clarity. There was no more hiding, no more door number 2, where I kept my secret and raised my boy in quiet independence. That door was gone. Malik had walked through it with 2 words, and it had closed behind him permanently. The only choice left was whether I'd walk through it after him, standing upright and facing what came next, or spend the rest of my life On the wrong side of a door my own son had already opened. The gossip started before I woke up the next morning. I know because my phone had 11 notifications. By the time I reached the kitchen, Google alerts I'd set up 3 years earlier. A paranoid habit that started after the Lenox Square food court, when Malik pointed at the television and said that man looks like me. I'd programmed Julian's name and Sterling Holdings into my phone, so I'd have warning. If anything ever surfaced connecting his world to mine, nothing ever had. Until now. Sterling airs gala surprise, sources claim secret child revealed at foundation event. That was the mildest headline. Others used words like love child and hidden and bombshell. None of them had Malik's name. None had mine. But they had descriptions. A woman with a young boy. A dramatic moment near the refreshment table. Julian Sterling visibly shaken. One gossip blog had posted a blurry photograph taken from across the ballroom. Just shapes. My back. Malik's small frame. Julian's frozen posture. Shapes were enough for people who made a living. Filling in blanks. Constance called at 9. Her voice had the careful, measured quality bosses use. When they're balancing concern against calculation. I need to understand what happened last night, Nia. I gave her enough, not everything, enough for her to grasp that my personal history had collided with the Sterling family in a way I hadn't planned, and that I was managing it privately through proper legal channels, and that the hotel would not become part of the story. I need this contained. We're a 32-room boutique property. We don't survive the kind of attention that follows the Sterling name. It won't reach the hotel. Make sure it doesn't. She hung up, and I sat at the kitchen table with cold coffee, wondering whether that was a promise I had any power to keep. That afternoon, I made a phone call. That changed everything. Not to Julian, not to Vivian, to a legal aid office near the university that I found through a referral from Malik's pediatrician, a family law attorney named Portia, who worked out of a converted duplex with mismatched waiting room chairs and filing cabinets that didn't fully close. I sat in her small office and told her the entire story, start to finish. The Callaway, Julian, the rooftop, 8 months, Vivian's lunch, the photographs and the check and the threats, the phone call, my disappearance, the pregnancy, 5 years of silence, the gala. Hi, Dad. Every important person room, the legal email that arrived. Before I'd started my car, Portia listened without interrupting. When I finished, she took off her glasses and cleaned them. On the hem of her shirt. You have rights, she said, more than you think you do. And they have money, more than you want to imagine. The question is whether we can make the rights louder. Then the money? That sentence became the foundation. I built everything else on. The DNA test happened on a Wednesday. At a clinic I chose. A small medical office in a strip mall. Between a dry cleaner and a phone case store. Fluorescent lighting, vinyl floors, year-old magazines. I wanted ordinary. I wanted a space where power couldn't seep. Through the architecture, Julian arrived alone. Jeans and a plain jacket. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. That made 2 of us. Malik was restless in the waiting room, picking up magazines, putting them down, swinging his legs against the plastic chair. Why are we at the doctor? Just a quick checkup, baby. He accepted that, with the skepticism of a 5-year-old. Who knows he's being handled, but hasn't developed the vocabulary to name it. Julian sat 2 chairs away. Close enough to be present, far enough not to assume. He kept glancing at Malik, with an expression I can only describe as hunger. Not aggressive, not possessive, but starving. Like a man told a feast existed 5 years, after everyone else had eaten. Hey Malik, what grade are you in? I'm not in a grade, I'm in kindergarten. That's before grades. Right. My mistake. What's your favorite thing about kindergarten? Snack time and the fish tank. There's a fish named Rocket, and he's the fastest one. Rocket. Good name for a fish. I named him. The teacher let me because I was the one who noticed him first. You're observant. That's a valuable quality. Malik considered this new word. What does observant mean? Means you notice things other people miss. My son nodded slowly, the way he did when something slotted into place. Inside his understanding. I am that, he said matter-of-factly, and went back to swinging his legs. I watched this exchange and felt something I was not prepared for. Not jealousy, not anger, grief. Pure, specific grief for the hundreds of small conversations. Exactly like this one. That should have happened over 5 years, and never did. Questions about fish in school, and what words mean. Bedtime negotiations, morning routines. The ordinary, irreplaceable architecture of knowing your own child. Architecture that can't be built in a waiting room, because it requires years of daily accumulation. And Julian had missed every single day, because of Vivian, because of me, because of fear that called itself love, and silence that called itself protection. The test took 3 minutes. Cheek swabs. Malik thought it was funny. Julian and I both leaned in to reassure him. At the same moment, and our shoulders touched, and neither of us pulled away. And for 4 seconds, we were just two parents, making sure their child wasn't scared. It was the first time we'd functioned together, brief and unplanned, and it opened something in me that I wasn't ready to look at directly. Julian asked if we could stay, not at a restaurant or a private club, the park behind the strip mall. A patch of grass with 2 weathered benches, and a swing set that squeaked. Malik sprinted for the swings. Julian and I sat on a bench with careful distance between us, and watched our son pump his legs, trying to reach something invisible above his head. The photographs your mother showed me, I said after a while. Walk me through them. He did, one by one, from memory. The fundraiser image that had gutted me, the tall woman, was a Sterling Foundation donor he'd been introduced to twice. He couldn't remember her name. The hand-on-back gesture was something his PR coach instructed at events, because physical warmth projected approachability. The images during our relationship were business dinners and charity appearances where he stood beside people he barely knew, while cameras documented it. Your mother selected those photographs specifically. My mother selects everything. She controls what people see and what they don't. She did it with my father's relationships. She did it with business partners who challenged her. And she did it to you. He was quiet for a moment, watching Malik swing higher. After you vanished, I tried to find you. Called your number for days. Before the disconnection message, went to the Callaway. They told me you'd resigned. I asked my mother. She told me you'd accepted a transition package, that you wanted distance, that you'd moved on, and you stopped looking, not immediately, but every avenue was closed. And my mother kept repeating the same story. She left Julian, she chose to go. And eventually I stopped. Because accepting that someone chose to leave is less painful than chasing a person who doesn't want to be found. He paused. She told me you'd been taken care of. Her words. I didn't press for details, because I was afraid of what they'd be. The version of me Vivian had sold to Julian, a woman who took a payout and walked away. The version of Julian she'd sold to me, a man who rotated through women and wouldn't notice one more absence. She'd authored both stories, cast both roles, and we'd each played our part, without ever comparing scripts. My father loved someone, Julian said after a silence. Before my mother. I found out years after he died, letters in a box in his study, that my mother thought she'd destroyed. He'd loved this woman, and my mother ended it. Lawyers. Financial pressure. The woman disappeared. My father married my mother 6 months later. He spent 20 years disappearing into a bottle. I always thought it was company pressure, his weakness. But it was grief. He lost someone he loved, because his mother decided the relationship was unsuitable, and he never found his way back. He looked at me. She ran the same play on us. The exact same one. A generation later, Malik launched himself off the swing at the peak of its arc. Did you see that? I flew. You flew, Julian said, and the smile he gave our son held so much love and so much loss, compressed into a single expression, that I had to look at the ground to keep my composure. Results came Monday. 99.9% probability. Malik is Julian Sterling's biological son, something I'd always known, converted into something the world couldn't argue with. My lawyer, Portia, called me at the hotel during lunch. I sat in my office staring at the wall and felt the hollow weight of certainty, replacing secrecy. Knowing your child's father and proving it are different currencies. Now it was proven, in ink, on file, in language no lawyer could dispute, and no powerful woman could rewrite. The mediation happened at Portia's duplex office. Folding table, mismatched chairs, old coffee and carpet that needed replacing. Julian brought one attorney, hired independently of Sterling Holdings. Portia noted that it meant he was separating from his mother's infrastructure. 4 hours to translate love and loss and parenthood into subsections and clauses. Primary custody to me, structured visitation, Wednesdays, alternating weekends, building toward overnights after 90 days, joint authority on education, medical, and public exposure, child support at a level that blurred my vision, not because it was punitive, but because it represented what I'd been doing alone for 5 years on catering wages and borrowed cars. The clauses I fought hardest for: no media appearances involving Malik without both parents' written consent, no press statements without mutual agreement, no unannounced contact from extended family. My diplomatic language for Vivian Sterling: does not get access to my son without my explicit advance permission. Julian agreed to every point, not reluctantly, not after negotiation. He read each clause, nodded, and signed. I would have asked for this myself, he said. I believed him. And that scared me more than anything, because believing Julian again felt like stepping onto ground that had already collapsed under me once. Julian's first solo outing with Malik was the aquarium. I drove Malik to the meeting point, and he was vibrating in his car seat, talking without pause about which fish he wanted to see, and whether the aquarium had anything faster than Rocket, and whether his dad, he was saying my dad naturally, like the phrase had been waiting in his vocabulary for years, and had finally been activated, knew anything about sharks. Julian knelt when Malik ran toward him. My son threw his arms around this man he'd known for barely 2 weeks, with the kind of trust only children possess. Complete, immediate, given without negotiation. I sat in that parking lot for 7 minutes before I could leave. At home, I checked my phone 14 times in the first hour. I cleaned the kitchen, reorganized Malik's bookshelf by author, then by color, then back to author. I folded laundry that didn't need folding. I did everything except sit still, because stillness meant thinking, and thinking meant confronting the fact that I couldn't tell whether I was afraid of this going wrong or afraid of it going right. Because if Julian was good at this, if he was patient and present and gentle with our son, the way I'd seen him be gentle with me, on quiet Sunday mornings, then the narrative I'd built to justify 5 years of secrecy would lose one of its load-bearing walls, and I wasn't sure the rest of the structure could stand without it. That evening, Julian sent a photograph. Malik asleep in the back seat, mouth slightly open, one arm wrapped around a stuffed octopus from the gift shop. He told me octopuses have 3 hearts. Then he told me that means they can love 3 people at the same time. Then he fell asleep. I don't know what I did to deserve him, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to earn it. Thank you for keeping him safe, for raising him into this. I'm sorry for the years. I'll make them count going forward. I read that message 4 times. I didn't reply for 2 hours, because I didn't trust what would come out. If I started typing immediately, every version I drafted in my head was either too much or not enough. Too warm and it would crack open something I wasn't ready to feel. Too distant and it would punish him for showing up in exactly the way I'd spent 5 years wishing he could. When I finally responded, I kept it simple. He loves the octopus. See you Wednesday. But something moved inside me. Not forgiveness. Forgiveness is enormous, and I wasn't ready for its weight. Something smaller, a hairline crack in a wall. I've spent 5 years reinforcing, not enough to see through, but enough to let light in, where there had been none. My grandmother was awake when I got Malik to bed. Kitchen table, T. Surgical leg elevated on a cushioned chair, reading glasses low on her nose. A crossword puzzle she'd been working on for days. I told her everything. The mediation, the custody arrangement, the aquarium, the octopus, the message. She listened completely, hands wrapped around her mug, like she was taking the temperature of the conversation, through the ceramic. "He seems like he wants to do right by that boy," she said when I finished. "I think he does. Wanting and doing are different verbs, baby." She looked at me steadily over the rim of her glasses. "And powerful families don't surrender control easily. His mother built that family's machinery piece by piece. She'll use it again. That's not a guess. That's a pattern." She set down her tea. There were stories, years back, about Julian's father, about a woman he loved before Vivian. People who were around then said Vivian didn't just end the relationship. She took it apart, carefully, strategically, until the woman believed leaving was her own decision. She paused, letting the weight of that settle into the kitchen. Sound familiar? It sounded like my own story read back to me, from a generation I'd never witnessed. What happened to the woman? Nobody knows. That's the point. When Vivian removes someone from the picture, they stay removed. I went to bed that night, with my grandmother's warning lodged between my ribs, like something sharp I couldn't cough up. I told myself things were different now. There were legal agreements, a custody framework. Julian was standing up. The old playbook couldn't work the same way twice.
Every time Nia builds stable ground under her feet, someone moves the floor. She gets a good job. The gala invitation arrives. She gets legal protection. And now her grandmother is telling her about a woman who disappeared a generation ago because Vivian decided she was inconvenient. Julian's father loved someone before Vivian. That woman vanished. Nia loved Julian. She vanished. Both times, the same woman, the same playbook. But Nia is the first person in this story who came back. She didn't choose to come back. A 5-year-old in a clip-on bow tie made that choice for her. But she's back. And Vivian knows it. Subscribe and drop a comment, because what shows up on Nia's doorstep next proves Vivian has been preparing for this moment longer than anyone realized.
3 days later, an envelope appeared on my doormat. No return address, no postmark, no stamp. Hand-delivered by someone who had stood on my porch. Inside was a photocopy of the check Vivian had placed in front of me 5 years ago, the check I never touched, the check I walked away from, along with the unsigned legal agreement and the folder of curated photographs. But this copy was different. On the back, in handwriting that looked remarkably like mine, the specific way I loop my letters, the angle of my signature, the stroke pattern I've used since elementary school, was an endorsement, my name, written as if I'd flipped that check over and signed it and walked it straight to a bank. Beneath the check was a fabricated deposit record, an account number I'd never seen, a deposit amount matching the check exactly, dated 3 days after the lunch at the estate, and clipped to both documents, a typed page, no letterhead, no attribution, no signature. Sources close to the Sterling family confirmed that the mother of the recently revealed child previously accepted a substantial financial settlement from the family in exchange for a clean and permanent separation. Despite this agreement, she has now resurfaced, seeking additional financial support and public visibility. The Sterling family is cooperating with legal counsel to address this breach of the original terms. Forged signature, fabricated deposit, a narrative that transformed me from a frightened young mother into a calculating fraud who took money, vanished, and came back for more. This wasn't a warning. This was a weapon, engineered with precision, documented with care, designed to detonate my credibility in any courtroom and any headline simultaneously. If a judge saw this during a custody challenge, every choice I'd made would be reframed as deception for profit. If the press published it, I'd become the villain overnight. If Julian believed it, if some part of him looked at forged evidence and chose his mother's version one more time, I stood in my kitchen, holding fabricated proof of a crime I didn't commit. Not fear, Fear was familiar territory. This was the recognition that the woman who tried to erase me once had been watching and waiting and preparing for the exact moment her son stepped out of formation. Maybe she'd built this weapon. The day I walked out without signing. Maybe the day Malik was born. Maybe she kept weapons like this, pre-assembled, for anyone who might eventually become a problem. I didn't know the timeline. What I knew was that the envelope on my doormat meant Vivian Sterling wasn't finished with me. She was just getting started. I was more afraid standing in my kitchen than I'd been in that ballroom. At the gala, the threat was secret surfacing. Now the threat was lies, being constructed on top of the truth, layer by careful layer, document by manufactured document, until the real story was buried so deep, even the people living it couldn't dig it out. I walked to Malik's room. He'd fallen asleep on top of his covers, still in his clothes, the octopus tucked under his chin, with tentacles splayed across the pillow. His breathing was slow and deep. His face in sleep looked so much like Julian's that the ache in my chest couldn't decide if it was love or grief. I stood in his doorway, with those forged documents in my hand, and I understood something, with a clarity that felt like ice water. I wasn't the 24-year-old who could be erased quietly. I had legal agreements with my name on them. I had a lawyer who believed in rights over resources. I had a co-parenting framework documented and signed. I had 5 years of bank statements and tax returns, proving I never cashed a check from anyone named Sterling. And I had a man, maybe, who was finally beginning to see his mother for what she was. But Vivian had paper too. Forged paper, fabricated records, a press narrative ready to deploy at maximum damage, and the resources to make any version of reality she constructed look more credible than the truth. I photographed every document, front and back, high resolution, emailed them to Portia, with a subject line that read, Vivian Sterling, forged evidence, urgent. Placed the originals in my grandmother's fireproof safe, the same safe that held the deed to her house, and my birth certificate, and every important piece of paper our family had ever needed to prove we existed and mattered. Then I made tea, sat at the kitchen table, where my grandmother had done her crossword hours earlier, and I thought about what comes next. Not the panicked, scattered way I used to think when Malik was a baby, and every day felt like a tightrope walk. Clearly, strategically, the way you think when you've been afraid so long. That fear has become something you work with, instead of something that works on you. 5 years of silence didn't protect Malik. It delayed the collision, and guaranteed it would be louder when it came. But I have something Vivian Sterling has never had to contend with. The truth. Not a curated version, not a PR-approved narrative, not a folder of carefully selected photographs, designed to tell only the story she wants told. The actual, messy, imperfect, sometimes shameful truth about a scared young woman who made a choice she spent 5 years questioning, and a man who might finally be ready to choose his son over his mother, and a boy with 3 hearts like an octopus who has more love in him than any single family, Sterling or otherwise, knows what to do with. The truth doesn't have a legal team. It doesn't sit on a corporate board. It doesn't arrive in unmarked envelopes on your doorstep. But it's mine, all of it, and I'm done letting anyone rewrite it. What Vivian did with those forged documents, and what Julian ultimately chose, when forced to pick between his mother's machinery and his own family, that's a story for another night. She didn't stop, and neither did I.